My phone buzzed with a group chat notification I didn't recognize. Okonkwo family, added by someone who'd apparently fat-fingered my number into a contact list instead of leaving me off it. And the first message I saw, scrolling up out of simple curiosity, was my mother-in-law Beatrice writing to 12 family members. She's not really family. She's never worked a day for this company. She doesn't need to be at the inheritance meeting. I remember reading that sentence twice, standing perfectly still at my kitchen counter, the particular sensation of watching a suspicion I'd carried quietly for years, finally confirmed in writing, plainly, by the one person whose opinion of me I'd spent a decade unable to change. 8 years later, the company she was so carefully protecting from me would exist only because I decided to buy the controlling stake myself. My name is Adaeze Okonkwo, though Beatrice has spent 12 years making it clear she considers that surname more of a technicality than a fact. I was 31 years old, sitting in my own kitchen with my phone in my hand, when I read the sentence that would eventually cost my mother-in-law the family company she'd spent decades protecting from exactly the kind of person she believed I was. I remember the strange, almost clinical calm that settled over me in that moment, entirely different from the hurt I might have expected. Less an emotional wound, more the quiet, professional recognition of a decision that had, in some sense, already been made for me. I married Obiora when I was 27, into a family that had built Okonkwo textiles from a single fabric stall into a mid-sized manufacturing company over 3 generations, a legacy Beatrice guarded with the fierce, exacting pride of a woman who had married into it herself and spent 40 years making sure no one ever mistook her for anything less than essential to it. I remember our wedding reception, actually, the moment Beatrice gave her toast, praising Obiora at length for his devotion to the family business and mentioning me, almost as an afterthought, as a lovely addition to our family gatherings, a phrase I laughed off at the time as simply awkward wedding speech phrasing, not yet understanding how precisely it foreshadowed the role she intended for me to occupy for the following decade. I came from a family of accountants and teachers, entirely respectable, entirely unconnected to textiles, and Beatrice made her opinion of that gap between our families clear within the first 6 months of our engagement, in comments delivered with just enough plausible deniability that I could never quite call them out directly without sounding oversensitive. A remark about how some people just aren't built for the pressures of a family business, offered unprompted at a dinner where no one had raised the topic. Or a pointed comment about how real understanding of the company takes growing up inside it, delivered while looking directly at me across a table full of Obiora's cousins, who had, in fact, grown up inside it. I tried, genuinely, for the first 3 years of our marriage, to find a place in the family business. I had an MBA in finance, a genuine talent for reading a company's books and understanding exactly where money was quietly leaking out, and I offered, more than once, to help with the company's increasingly strained cash flow situation. I remember one specific evening, early in our marriage, sitting at Papa's dining table and walking through a simplified cash flow projection I'd sketched out on a napkin, genuinely excited to contribute something useful, only to watch Beatrice redirect the conversation within minutes toward Junior's latest sales figures, the napkin quietly disappearing under a stack of dinner plates before anyone had really engaged with it. Beatrice always found a reason to redirect the offer. Junior, my husband's younger brother, was already handling the finances, despite Junior's actual qualifications amounting to a business degree he'd finished with considerable family assistance, and a tendency to make expensive decisions based on instinct rather than any model I ever saw him build. Junior was blood. I was, in Beatrice's careful phrasing, wonderful for Obiora, a compliment that always somehow implied I existed primarily in relation to her son, rather than as anyone with skills of my own worth using. I stopped offering formal help around year 4, not out of any dramatic confrontation, just the slow, familiar exhaustion of extending something repeatedly and watching it decline in increasingly transparent ways. Obiora never mocked my work. That was almost the hardest part to explain to anyone who asked, later, why I'd stayed as long as I had. He believed in me privately, genuinely, listening for hours whenever I talked through a difficult case at Meridian, proud in a way that felt entirely real whenever it was just the two of us. He simply went quiet whenever his mother made believing in me public, deflecting her comments with a small, apologetic laugh rather than a direct correction, as though disagreeing with her openly cost more than he was willing to pay. It was a strange, specific kind of loneliness, being fully seen in private and quietly diminished in public by the same family. And I think it took me years longer than it should have to name that pattern honestly, mostly because the private version of him was real enough to keep me hoping the public version would eventually catch up to it. The inheritance meeting Beatrice was so determined to keep me away from, I later learned, concerned decisions about long-term ownership structure. As Papa, my father-in-law, began thinking seriously about succession planning in his early 70s, Obiora mentioned the meeting to me himself, the week before it happened, in the careful, apologetic tone he used whenever he was about to disappoint me on his mother's behalf. "Mom just thinks it should be immediate family only," he said. "I know that's not fair. I don't know how to fight her on it without causing a whole thing." I told him I understood. The way I told him I understood a dozen similar moments over 4 years of marriage, each one small enough on its own to swallow, all of them compounding into something I hadn't yet let myself fully name. The group chat message arrived the morning of that meeting, and I read it standing at my kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, scrolling up through weeks of messages I'd never been meant to see. Beatrice coordinating with Papa's sister about keeping the meeting clean. Junior asking, with visible relief, whether Adaeze's opinions would even be relevant to the discussion. Someone else in the chat asking mildly whether that seemed fair. And Beatrice's reply landing with a particular, deliberate cruelty that ended the conversation entirely. "She's not really family. She's never worked a day for this company. She doesn't need to be at the inheritance meeting." No one in the chat pushed back after that. I scrolled through nearly 40 messages before I found the beginning of the thread, watching a plan assemble inoc itself in real time among people I'd spent 4 years trying to belong to. I sat with that sentence for a long time, feeling something in me finally fully settle into a decision I think I'd been circling for years without letting myself land on it directly. I remember setting my phone down on the counter, staring out the kitchen window at nothing in particular, running through 4 years of smaller versions of the exact same message. Every redirected offer, every wonderful for Obiora, every dinner where my own accomplishments dissolved quietly at the edges of a conversation centered entirely on Junior. This one simply had the decency to be explicit. I didn't confront Beatrice about the message. I didn't need to. Instead, I did something considerably quieter and, in hindsight, considerably more consequential. I called a former business school classmate, Priya, who'd built a small consulting practice specializing in manufacturing turnarounds, and asked whether she had room for a partner with a genuine talent for reading distressed companies' books. Priya and I had stayed loosely in touch since business school, close enough that she was one of the few people who knew, in general terms, about the frustrations of trying to find a place in my husband's family business, though I'd never shared many specifics even with her. She did, and told me later that she'd been meaning to ask me for over a year, having noticed, at various mutual acquaintances gatherings, that I seemed to light up whenever manufacturing finance came up in conversation. Despite never once mentioning it as something I was pursuing professionally myself, I gave notice on the volunteer advisory role I'd taken at a local nonprofit to free up time, quietly began building client relationships in the manufacturing sector, and told almost no one in the Okonkwo family any specifics about what I was actually doing, mostly because I'd learned by then that specifics were simply ammunition Beatrice would find some way to use. I remember telling Obiora that same week, a carefully vague version of my plans, that I was going to start consulting more seriously, build something of my own, focus less on trying to find a role inside a family business that clearly wasn't going to make room for me. He supported the decision, genuinely, though I noticed, even then, that he never once suggested telling his mother, an omission that told me plenty about how thoroughly he understood her likely reaction, without either of us needing to say it out loud. The 8 years that followed unfolded from the Okonkwo family's perspective, as a kind of quiet non-event. I attended fewer family gatherings, always with a plausible excuse, and when I did attend, I said little about my work, letting Beatrice's assumption that I'd simply never found my footing professionally go entirely uncorrected. I remember one particular Christmas dinner, around year 3 of building Meridian, when Beatrice asked, in front of the whole extended family, whether I was still doing that little consulting thing, and I said simply, "Yes, it's going well," and let the conversation move on, rather than correcting her dismissive framing with any of the actual numbers I could have offered. I'd learned by then that specifics only became ammunition in her hands, twisted into something she could use against me later, so I simply stopped supplying them. In reality, those 8 years held considerably more than anyone in that family understood. Priya and I built our consulting practice into a genuine restructuring firm, Meridian Partners, specializing in exactly the kind of mid-sized manufacturing companies that Okonkwo Textiles resembled in almost every structural detail. Family-owned, generationally managed, increasingly squeezed by cheaper overseas competition and outdated equipment neither generation had modernized in time. I made partner within 4 years, a milestone I celebrated privately with Obiora and told almost no one else in his family about. By year 6, I was leading acquisition deals worth tens of millions of dollars, quietly, competently, entirely outside the Okonkwo family's field of vision, building a professional reputation in manufacturing restructuring circles that had nothing whatsoever to do with the family, that had once decided I wasn't worth including. I saw Obiora's family maybe 4 times a year during that stretch, holiday gatherings and the occasional birthday, and each time, Beatrice's questions about my career grew vaguer and less curious, settling eventually into a kind of polite non-inquiry that told me she'd stopped expecting anything from me worth asking about. Junior, meanwhile, took over day-to-day operations at Okonkwo Textiles around year 3 of my own quiet rebuilding, a transition Beatrice celebrated loudly at a family dinner I attended specifically because Obiora asked me to, watching her toast her younger son's ascension with the same fierce pride she'd once reserved for describing the company's founding generation. Junior's tenure, from what I gathered secondhand through Obiora over the following years, involved a series of expensive equipment purchases financed through increasingly aggressive debt, a failed expansion into a product line the company had no genuine expertise in, and a cash flow situation that Obiora described to me, vaguely, as tighter than it used to be, never quite specific enough for me to act on directly, though specific enough that I recognized, professionally, exactly the shape of a company heading towards serious trouble. The connection to Okonkwo Textiles arrived at Meridian Partners entirely through ordinary business channels, with no engineering on my part at all. A regional bank holding a significant portion of the company's debt reached out to Meridian, one of several firms they routinely consulted for distressed manufacturing cases, asking for a preliminary assessment of a textile company facing serious insolvency risk. I recognized the company's name on the intake documents before I'd read a single line of the financials, and sat in my office for a long moment, coffee in hand, absorbing the particular strangeness of my own family's crisis arriving on my desk through a route that had nothing to do with me personally at all. I remember calling Obiora that same evening, not to tell him anything specific yet, but simply because I needed, in that moment, to hear a voice that already knew the whole complicated history, rather than carrying it alone for even one more hour. I brought the case to Priya immediately, disclosing the conflict of interest in full. My marriage into the family, my history with the company, my complicated relationship with its current management. And we agreed, together, that I would lead the assessment anyway, given how directly my specific expertise matched the situation, with full transparency to the bank and eventual counterparties about my connection. Priya reviewed my work personally at every stage, an extra layer of oversight neither of us felt was strictly necessary, but both agreed was worth the additional rigor, given the personal stakes involved. If this goes sideways personally, Priya told me, only half joking, I wanted on record that I checked every single number myself. What I found, working through Okonkwo Textiles' actual books for the first time in 8 years, was worse than even Obiora's vague hints had suggested. Junior's expansion into a synthetic fiber product line had consumed nearly 40% of the company's available credit. The new equipment sat substantially underutilized, due to a lack of trained staff to operate it properly, and the company's core, historically profitable business. The fabric line's papa had built the company's reputation on decades earlier, had been quietly starved of reinvestment for years in favor of Junior's ambitions. The company was, by any standard restructuring metric, roughly 8 months from insolvency, without significant intervention. I sat with those numbers for a long time before drafting the assessment, feeling something complicated and not entirely comfortable settle over me. Genuine professional clarity about what needed to happen, tangled together with an old familiar ache about exactly whose family legacy those numbers represented. Papa's 80th birthday celebration was scheduled for the same month. Meridian's restructuring proposal was set to be presented to the Okonkwo Textiles Board, a coincidence of timing that Priya and I discussed carefully, deciding, in the end, that the business presentation should proceed on its own professional timeline, regardless of the family celebration happening to fall nearby. Rather than either delaying the deal or rushing it to align with a birthday party, I attended the party as Obiora's wife, exactly as I had for 12 years, saying nothing about the presentation scheduled for the following Tuesday, watching Beatrice hold court among family friends with the same commanding presence she'd always carried. Entirely unaware of what the coming week actually held for her, I remember standing near the dessert table that evening, watching Beatrice accept compliments about her company's continued success from a family friend who clearly hadn't heard about the mounting difficulties, and feeling a strange, complicated mixture of pity and resolve settle over me. Junior gave a toast that night, praising his own leadership of the family business in front of the assembled guests, entirely unaware that the numbers underneath that leadership were about to become impossible to spin. Obiora squeezed my hand at one point during the toast, and I wondered briefly whether he suspected anything at all about what the following week held, though I'd deliberately kept the specifics from him too, wanting the professional process to unfold cleanly rather than complicated by family loyalties on either side. The board presentation itself took place in the same conference room Okonkwo Textiles had used for major decisions for over a decade, a room I remembered vividly from the handful of times I'd sat in its doorway as an outsider looking in during the early years of my marriage, never once invited to the table itself. Beatrice, Papa, Obiora, and Junior sat across from Priya and me, along with the bank's representative and Meridian's junior associate handling documentation. Junior recognized me first, glancing up from his own materials with visible confusion. "Wait, you work for the firm doing the assessment?" His voice carried the particular surprise of someone recalibrating an assumption he'd never once thought to question. Beatrice's head turned sharply, her expression moving from confusion to something considerably colder. Within seconds, her eyes narrowing as she connected the pieces faster than her son had, Priya opened the presentation, professionally, laying out the restructuring terms Meridian was proposing. A controlling equity stake acquired by Meridian Partners in exchange for debt relief and a capital injection sufficient to stabilize operations, management restructuring required as a condition of the deal, with Meridian retaining oversight authority during a 2-year transition period. Given the severity of the company's current position, Priya said, sliding documents across the table with practiced calm, this is, candidly, one of the more favorable restructuring paths still available to you. Without it, our assessment indicates insolvency within 8 months. Beatrice found her voice first, sharp and disbelieving. "You," she said, looking directly at me, her voice carrying the same particular coldness I remembered from 12 years of comments. "This is your doing." "I lead Meridian's manufacturing restructuring practice," I said, keeping my voice level, the same composed tone I'd used through 12 years of her comments. "This engagement came to us through the bank, not through me. I disclosed my connection to this family the moment I saw your name on the file, and I've operated under full oversight from my partner throughout." I glanced toward Priya, who nodded once, confirming. "But yes, Beatrice, I'm the one sitting across this table from you today, Papa, quiet until then, looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable moving across his face, the particular expression of a man reassessing 8 years of assumptions in real time. 8 years, he finally said, and none of us had any idea what you'd actually built. You never asked, I said gently, without any real edge in my voice. None of you ever asked. Junior looked, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely deflated rather than defensive, staring at the numbers Priya had laid out with the dawning understanding of a man watching his entire tenure get quietly, professionally dismantled by evidence, rather than by anyone's opinion of him. Obiora reached over and took my hand under the table, a small gesture that told me, more than words could have, exactly where he stood in that particular moment. The board, given the alternative, accepted Meridian's terms within the month. Junior was removed from day-to-day operations as a condition of the deal, retaining a minority ownership stake but no operational authority, a demotion he reportedly took harder than the insolvency threat itself, according to Obiora, who mentioned that Junior had spent several weeks afterward barely speaking to anyone at family gatherings. Beatrice's influence over company decisions diminished considerably under the new governance structure. Meridian required decisions that had once flowed entirely through her, now requiring sign-off from an oversight board that included, for the first 2 years, a Meridian representative, occasionally me, though I stepped back from direct involvement in most day-to-day matters. Once the initial restructuring stabilized, handing that work to a colleague to avoid the obvious complications of managing my own in-laws' company personally. The synthetic fiber product line Junior had championed was wound down within the first 6 months of the restructuring. The underutilized equipment sold off to recoup partial value, and Meridian's team redirected investment back into the historically profitable fabric lines Papa had built the company's reputation on decades earlier. Within 18 months, the company had returned to modest profitability for the first time in nearly 3 years, a turnaround that industry publications covering the manufacturing sector wrote about, briefly crediting Meridian's restructuring approach without, in most cases, mentioning the particular family history tangled up inside the deal. One trade publication did run a short profile on Meridian's approach to family business restructuring more broadly, quoting me discussing the general challenges of generational transitions in manufacturing companies without ever naming Okonkwo Textile specifically, a discretion I maintained deliberately, given how personal the underlying story actually was. Junior, to his credit, eventually reached out to me directly, nearly a year after the restructuring, asking whether Meridian might have any advisory roles suited to someone with his particular background. I told him honestly that I didn't think that would be appropriate given our history, but that I respected him asking directly rather than going through Obiora or anyone else. He took the answer better than I expected, and our relationship since, while not close, has settled into something considerably more honest than the careful competitive distance we'd maintained for most of the previous decade. Papa called me himself, 3 weeks after the board meeting, asking to have coffee, just the two of us, something we'd never once done in 12 years of marriage into his family. We met at a small cafe near his house, and he looked, that morning, older and more tired than I'd ever quite noticed at family gatherings, where he'd always seemed to carry himself with a kind of practiced, patriarchal ease. He ordered the same coffee he'd apparently ordered at that cafe for 30 years, according to the barista's easy familiarity with him, and sat across from me for a long moment before speaking, turning his cup slowly between his hands. He apologized, plainly and without excuses, for 12 years of watching his wife diminish me without ever once intervening. I told myself it wasn't my place to get between you and Beatrice, he said, turning his coffee cup slowly. I think I just found that easier than actually standing up to her. I'm sorry it took nearly losing everything to understand what that cost you. I told him I appreciated hearing it, and meant it, though I also told him, honestly, that I wasn't sure yet how much of the relationship I wanted to rebuild, given how long the silence had gone unaddressed. He nodded, accepting that without argument, and asked, quietly, whether I'd tell him more about the company I'd actually built, genuinely curious in a way none of his family had managed in nearly a decade. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, glad to finally answer that question for someone who was actually asking it. And we spent nearly 2 hours that morning, well past when either of our coffees had gone cold. With me walking him through Meridian's history, the deals I was proudest of, the particular satisfaction of building something entirely my own after years of being told I had nothing worth contributing. He listened the entire time, asking good, specific questions, the way I imagine he must have listened to Obiora. And Junior discussed the family business for decades, a version of attention I'd simply never once been offered before. Beatrice and I have not spoken since that board meeting. Beyond the bare minimum required at family gatherings, I now attend considerably less frequently than before. She reportedly told a family friend, according to something Obiora heard secondhand, that she never could have predicted my career trajectory, a sentence that struck me when Obiora repeated it as a fairly precise summary of exactly the problem. She never once tried to predict anything about me worth knowing, because she'd decided, from our very first meeting, that there was nothing there worth the effort of looking. Obiora has, in the years since, made real efforts to acknowledge what his own passivity cost our marriage during those earlier years. Conversations that continue, slowly, honestly, in a way I don't think either of us managed before Beatrice's own words finally forced a reckoning neither of us had been brave enough to start ourselves. He told me once, almost a year after the board meeting, that he'd spent years quietly believing his mother's approval mattered more than my dignity, without ever fully admitting that framing to himself, until he watched, in real time, exactly what 12 years of choosing her comfort over mine had actually cost. We've started, gradually, having the kinds of honest conversations about his family that we should have had over a decade earlier, conversations that don't fix 12 years of accumulated silence overnight, but that feel, at least, like an actual foundation, rather than another polite accommodation. He asked me recently, sitting together on our back porch one evening, whether I regretted staying in the marriage through those difficult years rather than leaving once his mother's behavior became clear. I told him honestly that I didn't regret staying with him, specifically, even as I deeply regretted how long I'd let his family's treatment of me go unaddressed. I think I loved you enough to keep hoping you'd eventually stand up for me, I said, and I think it took losing something enormous for your family to finally teach you how. He didn't have a defense for that, and I didn't need him to offer one. I think we're both still learning, slowly, what an actual partnership between the two of us looks like, now that his family's approval is no longer the invisible third party, sitting at every table we share. I think about that group chat message often, the particular careless cruelty of, "She's never worked a day for this company," delivered by a woman who had no idea in that exact moment that she was describing a version of me that had already, quietly, stopped being true, or was about to. I don't think Beatrice's cruelty built my career. I think it simply removed my last reason to keep trying to earn a place at a table that was never going to make room for me honestly. What I built afterward, I built because I finally let myself stop waiting for permission I was never going to receive. I think, too, about how different those 12 years might have looked if Beatrice had simply asked me, even once, what I actually wanted to do with my own skills, rather than deciding, unilaterally, that Junior's blood mattered more than my competence. I don't say that with much bitterness anymore. I think Beatrice genuinely believed, her entire life, that family loyalty and bloodline were the same thing, and I don't think that belief ever once occurred to her as something worth examining, right up until a restructuring agreement forced her to examine it whether she wanted to or not. There's a particular kind of vindication in watching someone's carefully guarded assumptions collapse under the weight of their own numbers. But I've found, in the months since that board meeting, that the vindication itself matters less to me than something quieter. The simple fact that I finally stopped needing Beatrice's approval to know exactly what I was capable of. That knowledge, I think, is the actual inheritance I ended up building for myself, considerably more durable than anything that inheritance meeting was ever going to distribute. If you've ever been told you weren't really family by someone who never once tried to know you, I hope you remember this. The people who decide you don't belong somewhere rarely get to decide what you build once you finally stop trying to prove them wrong from inside their own room. Sometimes, the most complete answer to being excluded isn't an argument. It's simply becoming someone whose absence, eventually, costs the people who excluded you considerably more than they ever imagined. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has anyone ever underestimated you so completely that your own quiet success eventually became the thing that finally got their attention? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to build something entirely outside a room that never made space for you, I'd love to hear how that turned out for you too. We share stories like this one every day. Stories about quiet persistence, overlooked belonging, and the moment someone finally builds something loud enough to be impossible to ignore. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.